January 1941. London breathes in the dark. Street lamps are hooded. Windows are taped. The Thames moves silently beneath bridges that might not be standing tomorrow. Somewhere above the clouds, bombers hum, not always heard, but always expected. Maps are spread across tables in underground rooms. Pins mark losses faster than they can be replaced. Radios whisper casualty lists like prayers spoken too often. Britain is still standing, but barely. Across the Atlantic, another world wakes two normal mornings. Factories run, but not for war. Congress debates words instead of weapons. Newspapers describe Europe like a distant fire. Tragic but contained. Officially, America watches. Privately, Britain listens for footsteps that do not come. Inside Whitehall, the question is never spoken aloud, yet it presses against every decision. Not whether Britain can survive tonight, but whether it can survive alone. Pride still fills the room, stiff and unyielding, but beneath it, something new is growing. Doubt, need, and a quiet reassessment of a nation Britain once dismissed. Because before Britain could change in public, British leaders spoke of the United States with restraint and courtesy. Speeches were carefully worded, statements emphasized shared language, shared heritage, shared values. Diplomacy required it. Britain could not afford to alienate a nation whose industrial capacity dwarfed its own. But behind closed doors, the tone changed. Private correspondence among senior officials reveals a consistent skepticism about American resolve. Many in Whitehall believed American leaders were constrained by domestic politics more than strategic necessity. Elections, congressional opinion, and isolationist sentiment were seen as obstacles that no foreign crisis could easily overcome. To British eyes, America's hesitation was not strategic patience. It was political paralysis. This perception shaped how Britain approached Washington. Requests were framed cautiously. Appeals avoided urgency. British diplomats feared that pressing too hard would provoke resistance rather than support. The United States, in British estimation, needed to be led toward action gently, persuaded rather than confronted. There was also a belief that America's democratic openness was a weakness in wartime. British leaders, accustomed to secrecy and centralized control, viewed American transparency with suspicion. Public debates about policy struck them as indulgent at a moment when survival demanded decisiveness. To many in Britain's wartime government, America appeared earnest, well-intentioned, and dangerously slow. Among British military professionals, opinions of American forces were blunt. British officers had spent decades refining doctrine through imperial conflicts and continental warfare. They prized experience, institutional memory, and adaptability under pressure. In contrast, the American military was small, underfunded, and rarely tested in large-scale operations. Its officer corps was seen as capable but inexperienced. Its enlisted ranks, enthusiastic but raw. Reports circulated within British staff circles questioning American preparedness. Training standards were compared unfavorably. Equipment was criticized as over-engineered or unproven. British planners doubted whether American forces could integrate smoothly into coalition warfare, particularly under fire. This skepticism was not always fair, but it was sincere. British officers had learned to mistrust enthusiasm unsupported by hardship. They had seen armies collapse despite confidence. In interview, America had yet to earn the authority that came from survival under pressure. Until that moment arrived, American advice was received politely and often set aside. Beyond politics and military assessments lay something deeper: culture. Britain's ruling class had been shaped by centuries of hierarchy and restraint. Authority was expressed quietly. Emotion was controlled. Status was assumed, not announced. Too many in this world, American behavior felt unsettling. American officers spoke freely. American politicians appealed directly to the public. American journalists asked questions that British officials would never answer. This openness was interpreted as immaturity. British observers mistook American informality for lack of seriousness. They saw confidence where they expected caution. They heard optimism where they expected resignation. The American habit of addressing problems directly, sometimes bluntly, clashed with Britain's preference for understatement and ambiguity. Even language betrayed division. British leaders spoke of duty and sacrifice. American leaders spoke of rights and principles. To British ears, American rhetoric sounded idealistic, admirable perhaps, but unsuited to the brutal arithmetic of total war. This sense of cultural distance reinforced the belief that Britain, not America, was the natural leader of any alliance. Britain had endured decline before it understood compromise. America, in British eyes, had not yet been tested by loss. The unspoken assumption together, these attitudes formed an unspoken assumption within Britain's leadership. America would eventually help, but it would follow. It would supply materials, it would offer support, but Britain would remain the guiding hand, the experienced partner shaping strategy and purpose. That assumption would soon be challenged. As American aid increased and British dependence deepened, the gap between perception and reality began to narrow. Each shipment of supplies, each negotiation, each concession chipped away at Britain's sense of control. The alliance that Britain had once imagined on its own terms was beginning to take shape, not as a hierarchy, but as a negotiation between unequal powers, and with that realization came a new question, far more unsettling than doubt itself. If America did enter the war, would it do so as Britain's junior partner, or as something else entirely? By early 1941, Britain's war was no longer limited by courage or resolve. It was limited by currency. The empire that had once financed global trade now struggled to pay for its own survival. Gold reserves were being transferred across the Atlantic. Overseas assets were sold quietly. British officials spoke confidently in public, but in private financial reports, the picture was stark. Britain could not sustain a long war on a cash basis. American industry, meanwhile, was accelerating. Factories expanded, output surged. The United States possessed what Britain increasingly lacked, not just material, but scale. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, ammunition, food. Everything required to fight a modern war in quantities Britain could no longer produce alone. The introduction of Lend-Lease marked a psychological turning point. Officially, it was framed as cooperation between partners. In reality, it confirmed dependency. Britain was no longer buying support. It was receiving it. For British leaders, this was deeply uncomfortable. Pride had to be swallowed. Conditions had to be accepted. Strategic priorities were increasingly influenced by American production schedules and political considerations. Britain retained its voice, but it was no longer the only one that mattered. This economic reality forced a reassessment of long-held beliefs. British skepticism toward American seriousness began to erode, replaced not by admiration, but by necessity. Reports from Washington became more hopeful. American political leadership appeared increasingly committed. Public opinion shifted as events unfolded in Europe and Asia. Yet this shift created tension rather than relief. To depend on America meant to acknowledge that Britain could not win alone. For a nation that defined itself through endurance, this was painful. Britain had always prided itself on standing firm while others faltered. Now it found itself waiting, watching American debates, counting American votes, measuring American timelines. Respect grew slowly, reluctantly. American efficiency impressed British planners. Production figures defied expectation. Organizational flexibility allowed rapid expansion. The qualities once dismissed as immaturity began to look like advantages. Openness enabled mobilization. Optimism sustained momentum. Still, doubt lingered. British leaders wondered how America would perform under fire. Would enthusiasm endure casualties? Would public support survive setbacks? Until those questions were answered, admiration remained cautious. Even before America entered the war, a deeper fear surfaced within British thinking. The fear of displacement. The war had revealed a truth Britain could not unsee. The world was changing. Industrial capacity, population size, and economic reach mattered more than imperial tradition. America possessed all three in overwhelming measure. Some British officials recognized this earlier than others. It felt supportive, reinforcing, helpful in exactly the ways Britain had hoped for during its darkest hours. Ships arrived, supplies multiplied. Planning staffs expanded. The alliance appeared balanced, respectful, cooperative, but as months passed, a deeper reality emerged. American factories operated around the clock, turning raw material into finished weapons at a speed that rendered earlier shortages almost irrelevant. Aircraft output alone began to exceed the combined totals of several European powers. For Britain, this abundance was both salvation and signal. Strategic planning reflected the shift. Combined command structures formed, but influence flowed toward capacity. American representatives arrived with authority backed by resources Britain no longer possessed in equal measure. The war Britain had entered in 1939 was European in focus. The war America entered in 1941 was worldwide. This difference mattered in every discussion. British leaders prioritized defeating Germany as quickly as possible. They pushed for direct action in Europe. With vast reserves, they could afford longer timelines and broader commitments. Tension followed. Disagreements over strategy surfaced quietly at first, over allocation of resources, sequencing of operations, and command authority. British experience was respected, but not always deferred to. British planners argued that experience reduced it. Neither side was wrong, but neither side was equal anymore. The imbalance became visible in logistics. American forces arrived with equipment designed for mass deployment. Standardization simplified supply. Replacement rates assumed abundance rather than conservation. Where Britain had learned to improvise, America learned to overwhelm. This contrast reshaped perceptions. British officers, who once doubted American readiness, now confronted American confidence, backed by numbers. Losses were tragic, but replaceable. Britain could no longer say the same. Even in leadership, the shift was felt. British commanders had been fighting continuously since 1939. Fatigue showed. American commanders arrived fresh, supported by expanding staffs and resources. For Britain, the realization was gradual but unmistakable. This was no longer a partnership of equals shaped by shared hardship. It was an alliance defined by asymmetry. Britain contributed experience, intelligence, and resilience. British speeches continued to emphasize unity and shared sacrifice. The language of leadership softened to the language of cooperation. Britain presented itself as guide rather than commander, advisor rather than architect. Behind the scenes, British policymakers began planning for a post-war world in which their influence would be reduced. Financial dependence on America deepened. Political leverage shifted. The victory Britain sought would not restore its former position. It would secure survival at the cost of primacy. Yet this recognition did not breed resentment alone. There was respect. British leaders recognized what America represented, not merely strength, but transformation. America was not replacing Britain. It was replacing an era. By the time the alliance reached full operational maturity, Britain's view of America had evolved completely. The nation once dismissed as inexperienced had become indispensable. The partner once expected to follow now set the tempo. Britain had entered the war confident in its leadership, and that the world Britain had known was giving way to one shaped by a power it once underestimated. That realization would echo long after the guns fell silent. Victory in 1945 arrived quietly for Britain. There were celebrations, parades, and moments of release, but beneath them lay exhaustion. Britain emerged not as the triumphant center of a victorious alliance, but as a nation deeply altered by what it had endured, and by what it had become dependent upon. The physical damage was obvious. Cities bore scars that would take decades to heal. Infrastructure was strained. Housing was scarce. Rationing, rather than ending with peace, continued into the post-war years. The empire had survived the conflict, but it was weakened, overstretched, and financially drained. More subtle was the shift in influence. During the war, British leaders had gradually accepted American primacy in production and logistics. After the war, that imbalance hardened into structure. Britain no longer set the terms of global recovery. Financial stability depended on American loans. Economic planning depended on American markets. Even strategic security increasingly depended on American power. The alliance that had saved Britain now defined its limits. International institutions formed in the aftermath of war reflected this new order. Decision-making weight followed economic strength. Britain retained a voice, respected, experienced, historically significant. But it was no longer dominant. The center of gravity had moved decisively westward. Within Britain, this produced conflicting reactions. Some viewed the transition with realism. They argued that Britain had traded empire for survival, and that survival was victory enough. Others saw the change as a quiet defeat, not imposed by enemies, but by circumstance. The war had accelerated trends already underway, revealing that tradition alone could not compete with industrial scale. Public discourse reflected this ambivalence. American power was acknowledged openly. Its role in victory was celebrated. Yet nostalgia-colored memory, Britain emphasized moments of endurance, the Blitz, Dunkirk, defiance, as symbols of national character distinct from American abundance. Pride shifted from dominance to resilience. This redefinition mattered. Britain began to see itself less as a ruler of systems and more as a guardian of principles. Influence became moral rather than material. Leadership became advisory rather than directive. The relationship with America adapted accordingly. Less hierarchical, more collaborative, but clearly asymmetrical. Strategically, Britain aligned itself closely with American priorities, recognizing that autonomy now required partnership. The idea of standing alone, once a badge of honor, gave way to a more pragmatic understanding of interdependence. The war had been won, but Britain's world had changed irreversibly. What remained unresolved was how Britain would remember America's role in this transformation. As rescuer, as rival, as successor, or as something more complex. A force that had preserved Britain while also eclipsing it. The answer would emerge not in official documents, but in memory, in speeches, memoirs, and the stories Britain told itself about the war it survived, and the ally that redefined its future. In the years that followed the war, Britain began the long process of remembering. Memory did not settle quickly. It evolved, shaped by pride, regret, gratitude, and loss. The story Britain told about America was never singular. It was layered, cautious, and revealing. Publicly, American contributions were acknowledged without hesitation. British leaders spoke often of shared sacrifice and decisive support. American industry, manpower, and